Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris, and I am genuinely fired up about today's story because for once, the biggest AI headline of the week is not coming out of Silicon Valley at all.
That is a great hook, so let's set the table for everyone listening. What exactly happened? Where did it happen? And why should anyone outside of Europe care about it this morning?
So earlier this week, on June 1st, 2026, President Emmanuel Macron stood up at the Choose France summit at Versailles and announced a record 93 billion euros in foreign investment pledges.
93 billion euros is an enormous number, but big summit numbers often turn out to be vapor. Break it down for me, because I want to know how much of this is actually about artificial intelligence.
That is exactly the right skepticism. And the honest answer is that AI is the beating heart of this package, spanning 71 separate projects that are projected to create more than 15,600 jobs across the country.
Okay, 71 projects is sprawling, so let's not drown in the aggregate. What is the single biggest commitment inside this haul? The one deal that makes the whole thing newsworthy on a global stage?
The headliner, without question, is SoftBank, which is pledging an initial 45 billion euros to build out AI data center infrastructure across the Hauts-de-France region up in the north of the country.
45 billion from a single investor is staggering. And SoftBank has made splashy promises before that did not always materialize. What does that money actually buy in concrete, physical gigawatt terms on the ground?
Phase 1 alone is designed to deliver 3.1 gigawatts of AI data center capacity by 2031, spread across 3 specific sites named Dunkirk, Bosquel, and Bouchain in that northern industrial corridor.
3.1 gigawatts is a genuinely massive amount of power, roughly the output of 3 nuclear reactors. Help our listeners understand why that capacity figure matters more than the raw Euro headline does.
Because in this era of AI, compute capacity is the real currency, and gigawatts are the unit that actually constrains who can train and serve frontier models, far more than dollars or euros sitting in a press release.
That reframing is important, and it makes me wonder about ambition beyond phase 1. Is 45 billion and 3 gigawatts the ceiling here? Or is SoftBank signaling that this is only the opening move?
It is very much an opening move because SoftBank has indicated the program could ultimately expand to 75 billion euros and 5 full gigawatts of capacity by developing additional sites elsewhere across France in the coming years.
Now here's where I get curious about the plumbing, because data centers do not run on ambition alone. Who is supplying the actual power and the physical equipment to make these enormous campuses real?
This is my favorite detail, honestly, because the partners reveal how serious this is. Schneider Electric is providing modular infrastructure and equipment, while the state-owned utility EDF is contributing a former power plant site for redevelopment.
Wait, a former power plant site being recycled into an AI data center campus is a perfect symbol of the energy transition this whole industry is wrestling with. That detail says a lot about the strategy.
It really does, and it is not an accident, because France has one of the cleanest and most abundant nuclear-powered grids in the world, which is arguably its single biggest competitive advantage in the global compute race.
That is a sharp point about nuclear, and I want to come back to energy later. But first, SoftBank is the headliner, so who else showed up to this summit with a checkbook worth talking about?
2 names really stand out beyond SoftBank. Brookfield is increasing its AI infrastructure investment plans in France all the way up to 30 billion euros, which on any normal week would itself be the lead story.
30 billion from Brookfield being almost a footnote here really tells you the scale of this moment. And you mentioned a second name that caught your eye, so who is the other major player?
The other one is Salesforce, which pledged 2 billion euros to establish its very first European Union AI innovation hub right in the center of Paris, planting an American enterprise software flag firmly on French soil.
That Salesforce move is fascinating precisely because it is an American company, and it points to the central tension I've been chewing on. This summit is supposed to be about European sovereignty, right?
Exactly, and that tension is the most intellectually honest part of this entire story, because the whole political framing here is about European technological sovereignty and building a more localized, resilient supply chain for the continent.
So let me play devil's advocate hard for a second. If your sovereignty plan depends on Japanese capital, American software companies, and presumably American chips, in what meaningful sense is any of this actually sovereign?
That is the billion-euro question, and I will not dodge it, because analysts at places like Oxford Insights have flagged exactly this. Much of the AI value chain still depends heavily on non-European actors at the critical layers.
When you say the critical layers, spell that out for me, because I think the specifics are where the sovereignty narrative either holds up or quietly falls apart under serious scrutiny from skeptical observers.
The specifics are advanced semiconductor suppliers, which still means NVIDIA and the broader American chip ecosystem, plus U.S. cloud providers and foreign capital. France may host more infrastructure while still relying on external technology and financing.
So the uncomfortable summary is that France gets the buildings, the jobs, and the electricity bill, while the highest margin pieces of the stack still flow back to a handful of American and Asian players?
That is the bear case, stated fairly, and I think it has real teeth. But let me offer the bull case because I genuinely do not think this is just expensive theater dressed up in patriotic language.
Please do, because I've been pretty harsh so far, and I want to give the optimistic reading its fair hearing. What does France actually win if this whole gamble pays off over the next decade?
France wins location, and location is not nothing, because once you physically build 3 to 5 gigawatts of capacity on your own soil, powered by your own grid, you control where European data is processed and stored.
That data residency angle is genuinely meaningful in a world of tightening privacy regulation. Walk me through why a European company would specifically prefer compute that physically lives inside France rather than across the Atlantic.
Because of regulation and trust, plainly, European firms increasingly need to keep sensitive data inside European jurisdiction for legal reasons, and having hyperscale compute on home soil means they are not hostage to shifting American policy winds.
And I suppose there is a strategic resilience argument, too. The idea that you do not want your entire economy's AI capacity sitting in someone else's country during a trade war or a diplomatic falling out.
Precisely. And that resilience logic is exactly why this is happening now, in 2026, rather than 5 years ago, because the geopolitics of compute have gotten dramatically tenser and supply chains feel a lot more fragile.
Let's zoom out from this one summit, because France has clearly been building toward this for a while. How does the $93 billion fit into the bigger national strategy you have been researching?
It slots into the France 2030 plan, where the national AI strategy already targets more than 109 billion euros in AI infrastructure investment overall. So this summit is really an acceleration of an existing long-term bet.
109 billion. As the broader umbrella really reframes the 93 billion as one very large chapter in a longer book. And NVIDIA keeps surfacing in your notes, so where do they fit?
NVIDIA is partnering directly on France's sovereign AI infrastructure buildout, which is both the strength and the irony of the whole thing, because the sovereign European future is being built on top of an American company's chips.
That irony is almost too perfect, and it captures the entire dilemma of this decade. You cannot build sovereign AI without the one company that everyone, everywhere, is completely dependent on for the silicon underneath.
And that dependence is precisely why some critics argue Europe should pour money into its own chip design and manufacturing instead, rather than building beautiful data centers that ultimately run on hardware imported from California and Taiwan.
So if you were advising Macron, would you tell him this is money well spent, or would you push him to redirect some of that capital further upstream into the harder, slower work of chips?
I would tell him to do both, honestly, because infrastructure and talent are necessary even if they are not sufficient. You cannot skip the data center phase, but you also cannot stop there and call it sovereignty.
That feels like the balanced take, and it raises the human question I always come back to. Beyond buildings and chips, what does this mean for the actual people, the engineers and workers on the ground in France?
Well, those 15,600 jobs are real, and many are high-skill roles in regions like Hauts-de-France that have struggled economically for decades, so there is a genuine industrial revival story embedded inside the AI headline.
That regional revival angle is the part that I think gets lost in the breathless coverage of euros and gigawatts. Reindustrializing a struggling northern region around clean-powered compute is a genuinely compelling vision if it works.
It is, and that is the optimistic note I want to land on because whatever the sovereignty asterisks, France is making a concrete, physical, multi-decade bet on being a place where the AI economy actually gets built.
Before we get to tracking the outcome, I want to put France's number in global context because 93 billion sounds gigantic until you remember what the American hyperscalers are spending. How does this actually compare?
That is a humbling comparison because a single U.S. company like Microsoft or Amazon is spending on the order of $80 to $100 billion in capital expenditure in 1 year alone on AI infrastructure.
So France's entire multi-year, multi-company summit hall is roughly equivalent to what the one American hyperscaler burns through in a single fiscal year. That really does reframe just how steep this competitive hill actually is.
It does, and that is why the European strategy is deliberately not about outspending the Americans, but about being smart on the dimensions where Europe has structural advantages, namely clean energy, regulation, and proximity to demanding enterprise customers.
Let's talk about that regulation point, because Europe is famous for the AI Act and strict data rules. Is heavy regulation a handicap in this race, or could it paradoxically become a selling point for France?
I genuinely think it cuts both ways, because strict rules can slow innovation, but they also build trust. And for regulated industries like banking, healthcare, and government, compliant European compute is not a burden. It is the entire value proposition.
There is also the question I keep circling back to, which is energy and the environment, because 3 to 5 gigawatts of data centers consume staggering amounts of power and water. Is the clean grid story actually solid here?
It is more solid than almost anywhere else, because France generates roughly 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, which means these campuses can run around the clock on low-carbon energy without leaning on coal or gas.
So how should our listeners track whether this gamble is succeeding over the next couple of years? Rather than just taking the summit's triumphant press releases at face value the way everyone naturally tends to do?
Watch the gigawatts, not the euros, because pledges are cheap and concrete pours are expensive. If those Dunkirk and Bouchan sites are humming with real capacity by 2031, then this was visionary rather than theatrical.
That is a perfect, falsifiable yardstick to leave people with. And I love that it cuts straight through the political spin. Any final thought before we wrap up today's deep dive on European sovereignty?
Just that the center of gravity in AI is slowly, genuinely shifting toward physical infrastructure and energy. And France just placed one of the boldest bets in the world that geography and grid power will define the winners.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.